Hello everyone, welcome back to another video lecture. Today we're just going to talk about what philosophy is. So if you've already taken some philosophy courses, you don't necessarily have to watch this whole video, or you can go ahead and put me on double speed and listen to me like a chipmunk or something if you want. If you haven't taken any philosophy before and you're sort of curious what it is and what it is we're likely to do, watching this video is going to be worth your while. I'd suggest don't worry too much about taking notes or anything like that. I'm not going to be a test on it or anything. But I'm going to talk for a little while just about what it is, just a tiny little bit about its history, and why it's worth studying, because I think that's a valid question that can be asked. So this video really pairs with the What is Philosophy document that I posted up on our Moodle site. So I'd recommend reading that, watching this video. That should give you at least an idea of what philosophy is. And then tomorrow, Wednesday, I'm going to be posting another video where we go into a little bit more detail about philosophical argumentation, really what it is in this course you're going to wind up doing, which is reading arguments, thinking about arguments, analyzing them, producing arguments, exchanging reasons with other people. And really when it gets down to it, that's what philosophy is all about. So I'm going to talk here a little bit about what it is in a very general sort of way. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk a little bit more concretely about what in practice good arguments are like versus what not so good arguments are like, which is something to keep in mind when you are engaging with people on forums or trying to write a critical response or an essay. And overall, these are valuable sorts of skills to have. So you've probably seen this picture that I've stuck up here before, The School of Athens by Raphael. It's really a kind of idealized picture of all of the great minds of antiquity. Raphael's, producing this painting not quite 2,000 years after many of these people lived. And in fact, this is a complete work of fiction because a number of the people who are in this painting weren't even all alive at the same time. Now, the really main people in the painting, if you look right in the middle, you've got Plato on the left in the red, Aristotle on the right, the blue, and a little further to left, a few people over from Plato in sort of a brown robe, sort of doing this kind of thing, is Socrates. So I want to talk a little bit about them because those are probably names you've at least heard before. There's a whole bunch of other people in the picture we could talk about, but I'm going to try to respect your time and not do that. So we'll talk just here sort of what philosophy is in general. I at least give one characterization of it. And like I said, we'll talk about what its value is. So starting with this question, have you ever done philosophy? Now, I really opened the video with saying, well, if you've taken a philosophy course or something like that, you don't have to worry too much about what's in here. You can browse it for pleasure or not. But whether or not you've taken a course or really read something that advertised itself as philosophy, odds are you've probably done some philosophy in your life one way or another. Really, engaging in philosophy is engaging in a certain kind of intellectual activity characterized by certain sorts of questions. So, if you've ever thought about morality and thought about questions of whether or not the ends justify the means, it's really a kind of philosophical question. It's an ethical question, it's a moral question, and philosophy deals with that kind of subject matter. Philosophy is very interested in ethics and what we should do, not merely what we do, but what we should do. What kinds of beings deserve moral consideration, right? Do all humans deserve moral consideration? What about animals? What about insects? Do ants have some kind of right to life? Do you do something wrong if you put out ant traps or a rat trap or something like that? What about chickens or cows or pigs? Do we do something wrong when we eat them? What about cats and dogs? Do they have some kind of right to life or other sorts of potential rights? What about ecosystems? What about things that don't actually seem to feel like a tree? Now, I'm not going to answer the question here. Simply raising it itself is part of philosophical activity. Trying to come up with good answers is really ultimately what we're striving to do. Are there moral facts at all? Right? Or is morality just an expression of how people feel about things? What sorts of things should you believe? And why should you believe them? What counts as sufficient evidence? Right? Is believing something on the basis of faith acceptable? Well, that sounds almost like a moral question again, which it is. If we want to stray away from a moral dimension to what it is we should believe, we can just start asking questions about, say, under what conditions should you believe somebody else's testimony? Under what conditions can you believe, or really in some sense, should you believe something that is unlikely, right? A report of something unusual, say somebody seeing a UFO or something like that. Does God exist, right? Now that sounds a lot like a religious question, which it is, but it's also a philosophical question. And really, depending on how we approach answering that question, I think helps delineate philosophy from religion, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. What properties does God have? Assuming God does exist, what's God like? Is God human-like? Is God not human-like? Does God know everything? Can God do everything? Is God all good? Is it possible for there to be an all-good, all-powerful being while evil exists? These are all good questions. What are minds? That's sort of a strange one. But really, are minds something separate from brains? Do we have some sort of non-material part to us that allows us to think? Can computers think? Under what kind of conditions might we want to regard machines as thinking things or feeling things? What is the role of government? And what should its limitations be? Right? What should the government be allowed to do? Right now, we're living through this pandemic situation, and an issue has reared its head, which is really a question of what sorts of restrictions can governments place on the individuals within their jurisdictions? If the government tells us, look, you aren't allowed to go outside anymore, right? And says legally you have to stay home unless you're going out for a certain specified sort of situation. Is that just? Is that acceptable? Even if it is for a good end, right? Are there certain situations under which it would be wrong for governments to do that? Is it ever right for them to be able to do that? All of these questions are really philosophical questions. Now, that's not to say that these questions cannot be fruitfully engaged with by people in all sorts of other disciplines, and people we might call something other than a philosopher, a political scientist or a preacher or whatever it might be. The point here is that we can all be philosophers and we can all do philosophy, even if we aren't necessarily taking a philosophy course, even if philosopher isn't what you would answer if somebody asked you, what sort of profession do you have, or what sort of thing do you do? So what is philosophy, right? What does that word philosophy even mean? Now, one popular view is that your philosophy is your point of view. And often you'll hear this sort of thing. Companies will talk about our philosophy is whatever. And of course, I cringe a little bit when I hear that, because a little part of me says, I don't think you're really doing this right. You don't really understand what philosophy is. You're just trying to tell me what you believe. But there's some truth to it. Right? Philosophy is, in some sense, your point of view. Now, philosophy comes from a couple of ancient Greek words, because philosophy, as we know it, at least in the Western world, originated in ancient Greece. These two words are philos, meaning love, and sophia, meaning wisdom. So philosophy is really a love of wisdom, quite literally. That's just what it is. Now, what is wisdom? Well, there's a couple of different ways to characterize wisdom. It can be a certain sort of ability, a kind of good judgment, being able to make the right sorts of decisions when they need to be made. It can also be a certain kind of knowledge, the really highest kind of knowledge, the most valuable kind, right? Knowing the best sorts of things there are to know. These two things can go hand in hand, but they can also come apart. So to do philosophy is really to love wisdom, that is, strive to have good judgment, be able to make good decisions. It also involves knowing certain sorts of things. Knowing the answers to certain big questions would be one way to put it, right? What are some of the most important sorts of questions we could have? Well, some of the ones we were just dealing with on the previous slide, say about does God exist? What's the role of government and so on? Perhaps what is the meaning of life? Those all seem like pretty big and important questions. And ultimately what philosophers are trying to do is find the best answers to them. Ultimately, they don't want to just raise good questions, but they want to find the best answers to those questions. Now, philosophy traditionally prizes the use of reason. Going back to the Greeks, reason has in some sense been put up on a pedestal. So to be a philosopher in one sense is really to prize reason and to really seek out the best sorts of reasons that are available. So it's really an activity of reasoning, of trying to find the best answers, that is the answers that are best supported by the available reasons, to big important questions. Now, in ancient Greece, there were a group of people who were called sophists. They were really wise people. That's how they advertised themselves. And they'd go around and teach people how to speak well, how to seem like they knew answers to these big important questions. Really, I think more than anything, they were really teachers of rhetoric. They were trying to teach people how to express themselves in a way that was really convincing to other people. And it didn't seem like, or at least from the picture we have, it didn't seem like the sophists, in some sense, really cared what the answers to these big questions were. Now, the philosophers, really, Socrates is taken as, in some sense, the godfather of philosophy, or the poster boy, or whatever you might want to call him. Socrates really distinguished himself from these sophists by not charging a fee and going around Athens, ancient Athens, arguing with people, trying to reason with them. He wanted answers to these big important questions like, how should I live? What's virtue? What's a good life like? What sorts of things should I know? How can we know things? He was asking these sorts of questions, and he would go and find people who claimed to have answers. And effectively what he would do is sort of talk them in a circle and talk them into knots until it became pretty apparent to not only Socrates, but whoever was around them often out in public in a marketplace or something, that in fact the supposedly wise person didn't really know what they were talking about in the first place. Now, Socrates tried to use his reasoning to pursue wisdom. He really inspired many people who came after him. So in that initial picture, the School of Athens, there is Socrates in there and Plato and Aristotle in the middle. Now, Socrates himself didn't write anything. We don't have any writings left from him, but his student Plato, so I stuck up here, we've got Socrates in the middle, in the bottom right, Plato to the left, Aristotle over to the right. So Plato was a student of Socrates, not in the sense that he paid Socrates to teach him anything or that they go and have specific lessons. Rather, Plato followed Socrates around. He watched him, he listened to him, he would talk to him. After Socrates died, he was put to death by the Athenians in 399 BCE. Plato wrote a whole series of dialogues. I'm going to pause just for a second here. Now here's the complete works of Plato. It's about 1,700 pages long on incredibly thin paper. We have basically everything that Plato ever wrote. He wrote a whole long series of dialogues, which are really sort of conversations between people. So Plato didn't sort of sit down and sort of write things out and say, well, here are all the answers to all the big important questions. Rather, he wrote conversations, taking Socrates typically as a main character engaged with other people, and the dialogues had various sorts of main topics to them. So they'd be about justice, or what the ideal city would look like, or virtue, or knowledge, or sort of pick a topic. Now, Plato did this. He also ran effectively an early university called the Academy for quite a long time, good chunk of his life. And there, Aristotle, another famous person that you probably heard of, was his student for about 20 years. Now, Aristotle himself went off and was perhaps even more influential than Plato. And of course, after these three thinkers, there's all sorts of other philosophy that takes place in the Hellenistic and Roman periods in the ancient world. We can trace philosophy through the Middle Ages. Makes, in some sense, something of a resurgence or a real renaissance around, well, the Renaissance, and of course the Reformation, the Age of Enlightenment, right up to the modern day. So philosophy has been in one way, it's a certain kind of activity. It's trying to use reason to find the best sorts of answers to these big important questions. We can also view philosophy as a kind of tradition. This long thing that's been going on for 2,500 years in a more or less continuous fashion, with people engaging with who's come before them. So even today, people engage with Plato and Aristotle and think about people from over 2,000 years ago, and what maybe they were getting right, maybe they were getting wrong. Science, as we know it, the natural sciences, is in some way a fairly modern invention. The word science itself really came to be used in the 19th century. It comes from Latin. It really just means knowledge. So when we think about sciences, natural sciences, social sciences, a lot of what goes on there, in fact, just about every area of human knowledge to some extent, used to be part of philosophy. So philosophy has been sort of an all-encompassing term for just knowledge in general. Over time, as different disciplines break off and you get relatively new disciplines like psychology. Psychology is only about a century old. In its current form, as something really separate, having a kind of self-awareness of being its own discipline with its own particular questions and methods. Philosophy remains this place or tradition where certain sorts of questions can be engaged with that typically aren't engaged anywhere else. Now, one good way to characterize philosophy, and this is really the way I do it in that piece online, is philosophy is really the pursuit of truth. And so let me say right here, what philosophy is itself is a kind of philosophical question, precisely because it doesn't admit of an easy answer. There's no empirical test. You can't go check anything. The world doesn't tell us what philosophy is. It's a human artifact. It's a thing we do. And so there are disagreements about what it is, just like there are disagreements about, say, what art is, right? Or what really counts as a science, right? What's the difference between a social science and a natural science? What's a real science, right? They're interesting, good questions. I'm not even going to try to answer them here. So we can characterize philosophy as the pursuit of truth. And I think that's really how philosophy has self-consciously identified itself for a long time, though even that characterization has become controversial in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. Now, it's not just any old truth. It's not just knowing a whole bunch of facts that you might spew it on Jeopardy or something like that, which, no offense to people who know a bunch of facts and spew them out on Jeopardy, because that itself is a kind of achievement, something interesting. But philosophers seek truth, and typically truth about controversial issues. I should perhaps add in important controversial issues there, right? Philosophers pursue wisdom, so they want good answers to tough questions. Now, philosophers tend to be interested in abstract or general truths, right? So when we're asking questions such as whether or not, in a given situation, do the ends justify the means, philosophers are going to be more interested on a higher, sort of more general level of in what situations, if any, do the ends justify the means. Thinking about this course, the meaning of life, we can think in particular terms. Do I have a meaningful life? Do you have a meaningful life? Right? Can an animal have a meaningful life? Could somebody who seems morally reprehensible have a meaningful life? Right? Is it possible that Hitler had a meaningful life? Right? Good sorts of questions. They are. But philosophers don't want to, in some sense, get stuck at that particular level. Instead, they want to move up to a more general level and say, what are the conditions for a meaningful life more generally? Right? If we want to say that you and I have meaningful lives, but Hitler didn't, why? Right? What is it that distinguishes us? Now, of course, there's some pretty obvious differences between you and I together and Hitler, one of which is that we aren't engineering genocide. So maybe that's the connection. Maybe there has to be some sort of moral quality to a meaningful life. We're actually going to explore this later on at the end of the course. In some of our last readings, we have some thinkers who explore precisely that kind of question. The whole point here, if you've gotten a little bit distracted, and it would be my fault for throwing Hitler into the mix, the whole point is that we aren't just interested in the particular cases. Instead, we're interested in the general principles that underlie the answers to particular cases. Now, what do philosophers try to do? How do we try to attain these truths about controversial issues, right? These general or abstract truths? Well, we try to clarify our subject matter, so we try to get clear about what it is we're talking about. A little later this week, we're looking at the introduction to our course reader, The Meaning of Life. We're going to see Stephen Kahn does a little bit of work there in trying to clarify what it is. Or it might have actually been Klemke, but we'll get around to that. So we try to clarify what it is. We try to ask good questions. We try to define the terms we're using. Right? So try to get clear about what it is we're saying, what it is other people are saying, and we try to draw distinctions between closely related matters. Often, things that are closely related can easily overlap. So I already drew one distinction, which we're going to have to come back to in the course, which is between a meaningful life and a morally good life, right? If we agree that Hitler led, a morally bad life, or he was evil, or we want to say something like that, and we want to say because he was evil, he couldn't have had a meaningful life. What we're doing here is we're trying to distinguish between two closely related things. Being a good person or an evil person, right? Some sort of moral quality, and a question of meaning, right? Maybe we're saying those two things, they're different, but they relate in a certain kind of way. Sort of like being able to take apart a sophisticated machine and be able to distinguish and be able to say, oh, well, there's this part and it connects to that part, and here's how they interact with each other, which helps the machine function in a certain way. If I look at my computer or my car or something, I can just talk about my car's engine or my computer. But of course, if I want to get more detailed, I want to have to start distinguishing between different parts of it. I want to have to talk about, with the computer, the motherboard, the hard drive, and the RAM, and the video card. And there are all these different components to it that someone unfamiliar with computers might not be able to name or distinguish. But if you really want to know about computers, that's what you have to learn. You have to be able to pick those things apart and say, oh, this is this part and that's that part, and here's how they connect to each other. Philosophers are doing the same kind of thing, but they're dealing with different sorts of subject matters. Instead of looking at computers and cars and things like that, they're just doing something else. We're examining different sorts of topics, different sorts of questions, but trying to do that intellectual work of ultimately getting clear thinking. Right? That's ultimately what we're trying to do. Now, there's two broad areas of philosophy. Practical philosophy concerns how we should act, what we should do. This is where moral and ethical questions about politics and society fit in. Right? There's also theoretical philosophy. This really concerns what the world is like, right, and how we come to know it. So epistemology is really the study of knowledge. Metaphysics is really the study of existence in its most general form. So some of those questions I was asking earlier, what are minds? Do we have souls? Does God exist? How do you distinguish between objects, right? What makes me different from you? Well, we have different consciousnesses. That's one difference. Look, all the particles of matter that make up who I am right now, at some previous point, make up different objects, right? I've got all kinds of stuff in my office, and I'm curious to see how much sort of looking around at my bookshelf and things people are going to be doing in these videos throughout the term. Not that I'm probably ever going to find out, but it is sort of something interesting. Now, all these objects around me, what makes me different from the chair I'm sitting in? Well, I can easily stand up and move away from the chair, and, so it's not part of me. But of course, I could, lop off a finger or something and separate it from me, and it would no longer be a part of me. So there are good questions here about what is it that makes something a particular object, what makes the same object something through time, especially if its parts can change. How do we come to know about the world? And we can try to distinguish between how the world really is on its own versus what we can know about it. We're going to be looking at really all sorts of dimensions here when we're in this course, because what we're doing is really examining a particular topic, the meaning of life, and that particular topic itself really sits at the intersection of practical and theoretical philosophy. So we're going to be doing at least a little bit of thinking about morality, a little bit of thinking about what sorts of things we can know, a little bit of thinking about what the world's really like. Probably at least a little bit of thinking, at least in the background, about how we should organize society. Presumably, if having a meaningful life is a good thing, then we should strive to have the kind of society where as many people can have a meaningful life as possible. Right? But that's something I think a little further down the pipe. That's not going to be one of our main concerns in the course. Rather, our main concern is really going to be, what is it to have a meaningful life? How do we answer that question? What abstract or general truths relate to that? Right? What is meaning? Right? What sorts of creatures are we interested in? Are we only talking about humans here or something else? what's the world like? Does God exist or not? Or is that something we just can't know, or at least something that we don't yet know? How does that impact the sorts of answers we're going to have to this question? These are some of the issues we're going to be looking at in the course. So I'm going to talk just for a moment about abortion as well, because it's a good intersection of practical and theoretical philosophy. Now, one thing to note here, I'm not going to be arguing in favor of sort of one side or the other of the abortion debate, right? We can boil it down, and often is boiled down to really two sides. There, on the one side, there's a woman's right to bodily autonomy, right? Woman should be able to do whatever she wants with her own body, including having an abortion if she wants one. She shouldn't have to, carry a fetus to term over the course of 9 months and so on. On the other hand, we can view the other side of that debate as really arguing that abortion is killing a person, right? And killing a person is morally wrong. So we shouldn't allow abortions to happen, because we shouldn't allow people to kill other people, right? Look, I think this is really an interesting debate. Like I said, I'm not going to be taking up a side here. One thing I hope you're going to find in philosophy is that, often when we look at a debate and we're on a particular side of it, we often look and think that the other side in a debate, or somebody that has a contrary position to us, is somehow just sort of silly or wrong, or they don't really understand good reasoning or something like that. Something I hope you'll come to appreciate in studying philosophy is that, in fact, sometimes there can just be too many good reasons. That there are good reasons sometimes on both sides of a debate, and those reasons conflict with each other, but neither side is just obviously wrong. And if, in fact, you sort of step outside of your own shoes and you come to try to appreciate somebody else's perspective, you can really see the force of the reasoning on the other side. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to change your mind, right? Say you've made up your mind on this abortion debate, you think one side or the other is definitely the right side. You can still come to appreciate the sorts of reasons somebody might have for the other position, even if that doesn't change your own mind. It just might change how you regard those other people, rather than regarding them as sort of senseless or incapable of reasoning or something like that. Instead, you can regard them as rational, reasonable beings, much like yourself, who come to different sorts of conclusions for some kind of reason, right? They weigh the reasons differently, or there's something else that maybe you haven't thought about yet, or maybe there's something they haven't thought about yet, right? If we come to regard each other as those sorts of beings, ones who actually accept and respond to reasons, ones who can get things wrong, you'll find that we can really constructively engage with each other in a critical fashion in a way that often we don't see modeled in our society, or at least sort of in our media. Often there's a kind of sensationalizing that goes on in debates and yelling and people just screaming at each other. If there's one thing that I at least hope philosophy can help us do, it's to, in some sense, calm down, respect each other, and really engage with each other, admitting that we might always be wrong, and that there are often more reasons to think about. So coming back to this abortion debate, so we can look at it as sort of simply, there's two sides, right? There's this side and there's that side, and they disagree. Even just the way I framed it and trying to explain what's going on there, it seems like there are different reasons being invoked, right? A woman's right to bodily autonomy versus not killing people. It seems like there's two different things. But here's the issue. In the abortion debate, both of those sets of reasons are, in some sense, active, right? You might emphasize one over the other, but there are real questions there. And look, here's a whole list of questions that are related and really go into that way of dichotomizing and making just those two positions. What is a person, generally? Under what conditions is something a person, right? Are only humans persons? Are there non-human persons? What exactly does it mean to be a person? Is a fetus a person? And of course, this naturally relates to that first question, but what is a person in general? There's the more specific question about, is a fetus a person? Is it right from conception or not? Why, right? What is it that makes it a person? When is it wrong to kill a person? Is it always wrong to kill a person? Right? What about in self-defense? Might not seem obviously relevant to the abortion debate, but right? There are questions there. What if the mother's life is going to be at risk, right? Would having an abortion then be the equivalent of a kind of self-defense, right? Or does self-defense require that the thing threatening you somehow is aware of the fact of threatening you, right? What kinds of decisions should a person be able to make concerning their own health and body, right? That certainly ties in. At what point does a fetus or baby become a separate organism from its mother, right? So here we go back to that question of what does it make something its own being, right? What kinds of activities should the state criminalize in general, right? Of course, the abortion question gives us a sort of more particular instance, but there are all sorts of general questions, general principles at stake here about what sorts of activities the state should have a hand in criminalizing or trying to restrict or advocate or so on. So what seems like perhaps a pretty simple debate, right? We have just these two sides, actually turns into a much more complicated debate and a much more complicated inquiry when we start really thinking about it seriously, right? To say that you've got easy, quick, and just uncontroversial answers to all these questions, I think is probably too hasty. These are difficult questions and they merit serious consideration, right? Again, I'm just going to echo this. I'm not here advocating for one position or the other in abortion. All I'm doing is pointing out that there are all of these relevant questions when we're trying to actually think about that one particular topic. Now, this isn't really an issue we're going to be coming back to in this course, so I'm not trying to open this up and say, okay, well, let's all jump onto this issue and start talking about it now. Just trying to show that here is a real public debate, right? Here's something where there is some real controversy, right? At least in certain places. Look at all of these questions that are, arguably they're philosophical questions. They're questions that just, interested, sensible, reasonable people are going to be asking themselves. And they all relate to this one particular topic. But they also relate to a whole lot of other topics as well. All right, I mentioned before that I was going to be coming back to religion and philosophy. They share something of a family resemblance. What do I mean by that? That they're similar in outline, right? Just like if you see members of a family, biological family, when you look at them, you can see sort of resemblances. If you put me beside my parents, you probably say, oh yeah, I can sort of see this from there and this from over here, and I can see how you kind of look like both of them, but you don't exactly look like either of them. Religion and philosophy are kind of like that. They, at their extremes, right, they can be quite different. Religion can be, and this is painting with a very broad brush, and I'm not saying all religion is like this, and I'm not saying all philosophy is like this. On one extreme, religion can be very dogmatic. It says, here's a set of answers to those big important questions. Shut up and just accept them and don't ask more questions and don't try to reason about them. At the far other extreme, philosophy is skeptical. It takes any set of answers to the questions and just constantly keeps asking more questions about them, and we can constantly ask more questions. In some sense, philosophy can easily be characterized by the asking of why, right, or how, just continually asking questions until the answers run out. Now that's just sort of at extremes, right? How can religion and philosophy be really different from each other? Religion is just giving a set of answers and saying no more questions. Philosophy is saying no, questions forever. I don't even want to actually stop and have any answers. But as you come in from those extremes, religion and philosophy overlap quite a bit. And if you get to sort of the middle ground, it becomes really hard to distinguish between the two. And in fact, if we're thinking in sort of the Western world, right? So if you think about Europe in the Middle Ages, including Middle East and North Africa and so on, really almost the only literate people were religious people. They were monks and priests and imams and this sort of thing. So the people who were philosophers were all religious people, which isn't necessarily to say all sort of religious people. Okay, even what religious people means. I'm thinking here people who are trained in religion in a certain sort of way and active in it. As being sort of a monk or a nun or a priest or something like that. So it can be really hard to actually distinguish between the two because they overlap quite a bit in the sorts of questions they ask, even the sorts of answers they want. Religion does and can use reason and ask really good questions and try to rationally evaluate the answers to those questions. And I hope you're going to see that. We're going to start this course looking at some theistic responses to the meaning of life. And they're going to be engaging with questions of faith and what reason can really give us, and trying to give good reasons for why religion has some kind of role to play in a meaningful life. So religion and philosophy do really overlap a fair bit, though they can be different. Okay, so let's come around, now that I've talked a little bit about what philosophy is, and I'll reiterate, everything I've said will in some sense be controversial because what philosophy is itself is a philosophical question, which means it's going to somehow be a question that's sort of controversial. There's not going to be an easy answer to it. There can be good reasons to believe different sorts of responses to it. So there's a whole domain. Typically, it now gets called meta-philosophy, which is really philosophy about philosophy, right? It's sort of philosophical inquiry about what philosophical inquiry is, and you might wonder how that could possibly be fruitful, which is a good sort of question. That actually ties in nicely with this question here. Why study philosophy? What's its value, right? I'm talking about, so we've got this thing that's been going on for 2,500 years, people asking questions and trying to reason and argue with each other and come up with answers to these big questions. But of course, the issues are controversial and people don't all agree on the answers to the questions. So why engage in that kind of activity? On some level, it doesn't seem like it's going to be very fruitful. What's it going to do? Is it going to make you money, or result in a better computer, or help the environment or something? Maybe, maybe not. Frankly, in a direct sense, I don't think it's going to have those sorts of practical products, right? If you study philosophy, if you become a philosopher, no, you're not going to sort of build a better computer or something like that, which is not to say there's no practical use for philosophy at all. So one answer, and you often get this answer when asking about why study any kind of academic subject, or what's the point of universities or something like that, if we're not pointing to practical products. One answer is that it's just intrinsically good to have a deep understanding of the world around us. Right? For something to be intrinsically good or intrinsically valuable means that it's really sort of valuable or good for its own sake, just in and of itself, right? It's not that it's good for some other thing. So one answer is really, it's just valuable, period, right? Why study philosophy? It's a good thing to do. That answer might not be very convincing to some people, right? When it comes to questions of intrinsic value and intrinsic good, right? What sorts of things are good or valuable or worth doing just in and of themselves? I do think there is some honest disagreement amongst people. So look, let's just take money, right? Is it intrinsically good to have money, right? It certainly seems instrumentally good to have money. That is, if you have money, you can then exchange it for all sorts of other things, right? Money's good because of what it gets you, right? You can trade it for all kinds of stuff. Is it good to have money just in and of itself, completely separate, right, from what having that money can go on to get you? I think some people honestly think that, right? They just want to have money to have it, right? It's not even for what it can get them. Other people as well, engaging in a certain sorts of physical exercise, they might just see as something good in itself. This is what they want to do. Other people regard exercising itself as something really not desirable, but it's worth doing, say, for what it gets you, health benefits or whatever it might be. So what instrumental reasons, if any, can be provided in favor of the conclusion that philosophy is worth studying, right? If we want to have an argument, you say, look, I'm really not convinced it's worth doing philosophy. Why should I do it? Why should I stay in this course? Right? Why should I think about the meaning of life? What's that going to get me? Right? And I say, look, it's just a good thing to do. And you say, yeah, I'm not really convinced by that answer. If I was, I probably wouldn't have asked the question in the first place why I should do it, right? What I'm looking for is some other kind of answer. I want you to point me to some kind of benefit that I regard as something as good of itself, that philosophy will help me get, right? So I'm going to try, at least, to give some reasons some instrumental reasons to study philosophy. So what does philosophy do, right, in and of itself? Well, look, you study these big questions, these big topics. You try to seek some really deep understanding of the world you live in and the human condition. Now, I do think that's intrinsically valuable, right? So even though, look, there's room for skepticism, and you and I can disagree on whether or not philosophy is worth doing on its own. And I'm not going to think you're an idiot or a fool or something like that. I think there can be reasonable disagreement here. But I do think it's wrong to think that philosophy has no instrumental value at all, because studying philosophy can be at least instrumentally valuable, because in studying philosophy, you're really honing a set of skills. You're developing a certain kind of skill set that is useful in a lot of different ways. Well-trained philosophers generally are excellent reasoners. They're clear thinkers. They're excellent communicators, both verbally and in writing. They're capable of engaging with complex material. They can learn independently. They can read difficult texts. They can organize information in a certain sort of way. So look, you know, I've been probably talking here for, I think at this point, 45 minutes or something like that. Look, I wasn't always this articulate. Well, okay, that might sound a little self-aggrandizing. I hope I'm fairly articulate. I hope that in my videos here, and you know, if you've had a class with me before, that I'm not hopelessly muddled and confused. I hope I'm constructing sentences that mean something, that advance your knowledge in a certain way. I hope I help make things clear. I hope that the written documents I give you, both slides and instructions and feedback and things like that, make sense. I wasn't always like this, right? This is a result of training. My ability to sit here and talk in hopefully an intelligible way for, you know, an hour or sometimes 2 or 3, depending on the context. That's a product. That's a kind of skill I've developed. I didn't always have this ability. This is really a result of philosophy. I've been studying philosophy and trying to practice, you know, doing philosophy in some sense for, hold on, I have to do a little bit of math now, and that's something I do a little bit less than engaging in philosophy. Is going on 20 years, something, yeah, 18, 20 years, something like that. So it's been a little while, maybe not quite 20. Let's call it a cool 17-ish years. So it's really training. It's trying to get better at something. Being able to think for yourself, think clearly, communicate clearly, approach complex subject matter, learn for yourself. Those are skills that are always valuable. It doesn't matter what you want to go on to do, right? You might want to go into healthcare or business, right? Anything, communication in general, right? From the most sort of practical things to the most sort of impractical things. I can't think of any sort of situation where a human being is worse off for having these skills than they would be from having them. So a little bit of data to support these conclusions, because, you know, I'm saying, oh, look, philosophy helps you do all these things. Now, of course, there's a really good question there. How do you know that? Are you just making that up, and or you're just saying all this stuff? Oh, philosophy does all this stuff and has all these benefits, so you should do it, right? Asking good questions itself is a part of thinking for yourself and being a good critical thinker. So why should we believe that? Well, I'm going to show you a few graphs on the next couple of pages. This came from the American Philosophical Association. I could provide an internet link for you if you want. It came from their website. This uses data from the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination. That's basically the standardized test that you have to take if you want to go to graduate school in the United States. And so we're going to see our results from the 3 areas of that test organized in a general sort of way. And I hope this shows up acceptably on the video. So these are just parts of that material itself. So these are just really screenshots taken right out of it. So one part of the GRE is quantitative reasoning, really skills at mathematics, generally speaking. And if you take a look at this, that line that runs up and down the middle, that's the average. And then you see results sort of to the left of that line is below average. If you look at the bottom, it's percent variation from the mean. So you've got the average right in the middle. And then you've got, if you take a look, you know, you go down and the lines over sort of -2%, 4%, 6%. On the other side, you got +2, 4, 6, 8%. Unsurprisingly, mathematical science, right? So mathematics in general, way up at the top, along with engineering, physics, and chemistry, and banking and finance, and things like that. Makes sense. And then, you know, I'm not going to pick on anything particular, but you can look down at the lower end. Students who intended to study philosophy in graduate school, that's how the results are organized, did a little bit better than average. Not quite 1%, maybe 0.5% better than average or something like that. You can see it, philosophy in bold, sort of 2/3 of the way up the list, just to the right of the average. So people intending to study philosophy were a little bit better than average at mathematics. Okay, great. All right, this is not what I'm trying to sell you on, and I'm going to tell you right here, there's going to be like no real number crunching in this course. I'm not going to like throw an equation at you and, oh, figure that out. It's just not what we're going to do. Which isn't to say there's anything wrong with doing that, right? Studying mathematics can be incredibly fruitful and very useful. This is not the kind of thing we're doing here. We're really doing sort of qualitative engagement, not quantitative. So the next graph here, verbal reasoning, percent variation from the mean. So you can look at the average. This time it's skewed to the left. And if you look way over to the right up top, there's the philosophers. So they did something, they were 6% better than average. And if you take a look, you know, and if you look down through some of the other results there, you see that there's some different variations. Some of the disciplines that have done really well in quantitative reasoning don't do so well in verbal reasoning, and so on, right? So students intending to study philosophy do very well with verbal reasoning. What is verbal reasoning? Really being able to articulate yourself and engage with other people in reasoning about complex subject matter. Now, not being in a physical classroom setting, we're not really going to have much of a chance to engage in verbal reasoning with each other in this course, which is one unfortunate aspect of teaching and learning online. If we were in a physical class, I'd be having you talk to your peers. Because we're going online and because I'm opted for the asynchronous delivery format, just to provide you additional flexibility, because I know lots of people have all sorts of things going on in the summer, just sort of generally, and of course with the current world situation, I'm well aware of the fact that all sorts of people have sort of unexpected scheduling issues. So I decided the asynchronous format was really best. So if you do philosophy in a kind of synchronous format, whether it be in person or online, you can probably expect to be talking to other people and talking about reasons, even just going through the videos and listening to the videos. I think that should be helpful because I'll be trying to verbally articulate certain sorts of points, and just being able to listen to those and understand those and comprehend things as they're being said is a useful skill. Now we come to the third component, analytic writing. So here we've got, this is really, you know, being able to analyze and reason in a written kind of format. And we are going to be doing that in this course. This we're going to be doing in the forums. This is what I want you doing in the critical responses, the argument assignment, the essay at the end. This is really analyzing complex information, providing clear reasons in support of a clearly identified conclusion, right? It's sort of an argumentative style of writing. It's not just sort of writing fiction or something like that. That sounded pejorative, sort of derogatory. It made it sound like writing fiction isn't somehow useful or interesting or valuable. I don't mean that at all. I just mean that this is a different kind of writing, and you're going to experience that. If you haven't done philosophy before, if you haven't read philosophy, you're going to see as you go through the material, it's a different kind of writing. It can take a little bit to get used to. It can be hard to understand philosophy quite often. I will tell you straight up, in my 15+ years of doing philosophy, I have become a far better reader. I can read almost anything and understand what's going on in it, as long as it's clearly put together. And even what it means to be clearly put together, there can be a little bit of argument about exactly what that is. I'm going to talk more about that in my next video when we look at a brief introduction to philosophical argumentation. Coming back to the graph for a moment. We still have that average sort of over to the left. Again, you can look at the various different sorts of disciplines that are you know, arrayed in different sorts of ways. Again, you can look at philosophy way up on the top. One thing I'll draw your attention to, if you look at the bottom, the percent variation from the mean, this time it's huge. In the previous couple of graphs, it's sort of a percent or two per line. This time, for every line on that graph, it's an extra 5%. The students who wanted to go on to study philosophy at graduate school scored something like 23 or 24% higher than the mean or average result in the writing. So analytic writing, that is really what philosophy is going to make you best at. And that's a valuable skill. If you wind up in a workplace somewhere and somebody wants you to go and reason about something and talk about it to other people, verbal reasoning skills are very important. Being able to write clearly, to be able to write about reasons, to be able to analyze something in writing, that's a very important skill as well. And ultimately, what's philosophy going to do? Why is it valuable? Studying it helps you hone a range of skills that will help you succeed at just about any task you want to pursue. So look, being able to think clearly and to express yourself clearly to other people, that is an important skill. And in fact, if you go, and I haven't put it in here, but maybe I should have. If you go look at various chambers of commerce and questions about what sorts of skills are employers looking for in excellent employees in a 21st century workforce, what do they really need? What do they really want? For the most part, right? Because of course, these are always generalizations, so they're never sort of universally true. What do they need? They need people who can think for themselves, who can think clearly, who can express themselves clearly, who can reason on their own. What they don't really need are just sort of drones who can go and do what they're told and just sort of repeat the same thing over and over. Sometimes, yeah, that sort of activity is required. It's also a very sort of easy activity to mechanize, right? We tend to build robots and machines that can do the same sort of task over and over and over again without having to think for themselves or draw distinctions or reason or engage in that kind of cognitive activity. Being able to do these things, right? Being able to learn, being able to adapt, these are really the most important skills to succeed moving to the future. We continue to be in increasingly novel times. One way to put it is that they're very uncertain times. I don't really think times have ever been all that certain. Really, if you look back through history, there's always something or other going on. There's always some kind of innovation or crisis or issue. But the pace of technological development is certainly accelerating. What we're doing even now in this online delivery format, trying to do this 10 years ago would have been much more difficult. Trying to do this 20 years ago, trying to do the things we can do fairly easily now would have been basically impossible. I can still remember the first computer my family ever had, right? I can remember a time before that. I can remember a time where, I can remember my first cell phone. I can tell you it didn't do anything near what my smartphone now can do. So in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, what's the world going to be like? What are you going to have to do? Right? What's work going to be like? How can you make a valuable contribution to your community, to your employer? How can you employ yourself and run an innovative and interesting business, right? One that's not only commercially successful, but perhaps changes the way things are done. The way you do that is by thinking for yourself. It's by being information literate. It's by having good critical thinking skills. It's being able to write well. It's being able to express yourself clearly, verbally, right? Being able to read and understand complex information. Right? It's being really an independent thinker. That's really what matters. And studying philosophy can help you get better at that. I can't guarantee that by taking this course, you're going to be a better writer or a better communicator, or you're going to find out what the meaning of life really is. I can't guarantee you any of that. But if you take the course, if you really put in a good effort, if you really take part in the assignments, you take part in the forum activities and so on, everything in this course is really designed to help you be better at reading and writing and thinking and expressing yourself clearly. And ultimately, that's really what I hope you get out of this course. Now, I also hope you find that the reading's interesting. I hope you come out of the course with a better answer to really this question, what's the meaning of life? If worst case scenario, it's sort of good dinner conversation, I think. But I think the course content itself is also quite interesting, and I think, what better place to think about this big important question than a philosophy course, you know, at university? Might be something that sticks with you. So I hope you stick with the course. I hope you find it valuable and interesting. I hope this video's helped articulate just what philosophy is and what kind of things you can expect in a very general sort of way, as well as it gave you some reason to stay in the course and to think that studying philosophy is a good sort of thing to do in general, even if it's only for a little bit. So with that, I need to go because it's now my virtual office hours. So I'll be back tomorrow with another video. Until then, bye for now.